Professor Schwarby. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. It is November 20th, I think, 2023. We're really honored to have with us Professor Marci Shore, who teaches intellectual history in the history department at Yale University. She is the person who can explain the intellectual context, I think, to the Maidan Revolution. We may get to that topic if she's willing, but let me just ask Professor Shore to start with any topic that she would like to start with. We have a great and attentive group, Professor, and we're so glad to have you with us.
Oh, well, Dan, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm trying to figure out, so I can't see you guys for some reason. Am I supposed to be able to see you?
You are supposed to be able to see us. Ellie,
Your
any ideas?
co-host.
We see you perfectly.
Can you change your view to gallery view in the top right?
Oh, right.
Here, how's that? Maybe I just did it for everyone.
Okay. Wait, yes, now I see. Okay, now I can at least see some of you. Okay.
Welcome again. Welcome again.
Wait, so I see some of you, and then it says 69 participants, but I see like 10 boxes.
That's
but some of you are hidden. Okay.
That's right.
Because I want to meet you,
yes,
or whoever I can meet, given the security constraints and constraints of this strange medium.
Yeah, let me explain the constraints. So as to be able to accommodate a larger number than we did last year, we have a category of people called attendees. They can raise hand, they can speak. Unfortunately, we don't have the bandwidth to have their videos. So we do have the videos of a group of 18 here called panelists, and these are mainly Ukrainians. Everybody, I wish we could put everybody on the screen, but that's the way it is.
Okay, I see. We have bandwidth issues. Okay, maybe I can at least meet the people on the screen. Let's see.
On my screen, there's a blue circle with an arrow, and this allows me to
with an arrow
scan through the participants. Do you have such a thing?
I can't find it, but my skills remain very primitive.
Well,
should I just call on?
Yes, let's let some organized person like Ellie. Yeah, could you introduce yourselves, and I have a sense of to whom I'm talking?
Yes.
Could we have Maria and Alona and Yelizaveta go first? Would that be okay, guys?
No pressure, and thanks, Ellie. Maria's not enough. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
My name is Maria. I'm a second-year master's student from Odessa, Ukraine. I got interested in this course because I'm interested in the topic of conflicts in general and resolution and management. So I'm looking forward to today's opportunity to listen to what you have to say to us.
Thank you, Maria.
Hello everyone. My name is Alona. I'm a student, a PhD student, and also a journalist here in Ukraine. And Marci, we've got a podcast with you on our channel, so that's great to meet you here on this meeting. And I'm really proud to be part of this. I'm really honored and proud to be part of our community here, to have this opportunity to discuss crisis management as well as the conflicts. And I'm definitely excited what we can expect to listen from your side, because as I mentioned, our podcast is an amazing one on our Ukraine world. So I'm already know what I can expect.
Thank
you.
You're
from Ukraine world. Do you work with Volodya and Tanya? Okay.
Yeah.
One or two more, perhaps Alina, Anastasia, anybody? Stefania, I see you ready.
Yeah, so my name is Stefania, and I'm on the third year on the bachelor degree in the university in Kharkiv. I'm studying international law. And yeah, I'm here on this course on the recommendation of my friends who were taking part in this course like previous year in the previous fall. And I'm super happy to be here and to have the ability to listen to all of our speakers and to ask questions and to gain some knowledges in this area to hear their opinions. So thank you.
Many, many thanks. One more professor, perhaps Dmytro Orlovsky.
Of course, Mr. Whitman. Hello, everyone. I'm a second-year student in major in international relations at Mariupol State University, and also I'm interested, and it's great to be in this course as well, and I'd like to hear this ribbon.
So you're from Mariupol?
No, from Poltava.
Oh, from Poltava. Okay. But you
Yeah.
were going to university in Mariupol.
Of course.
Okay. Yeah, I've just been thinking about Mariupol. Zhenya Maloletka, the photographer journalist, was here last week, and we did a conversation about the photographs that he was taking in Mariupol during the siege. And
Yeah.
I'm just grateful he made it out of there alive. Someone's raising their hand who I can't see.
I would like to bring in anybody who wants from Kazakhstan or Kenya to give us a sense of the scope of this group. I see again, McBread. I'm sorry that I've forgotten your real name. Okay, Sunaya, yes. Sunaya, go ahead.
I think that was Peterson Wawero who we were hearing briefly.
So I've asked Sunaya Toliba to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be on this course, and I'm looking forward to hearing hearing your answers and questions and lecture today, because it's quite fascinating that we have read like just some background of your works at the university. The Yale University. So yes, and we are the students from Kazakhstan as well. We attend as mainly attendees, and yes, it's been quite a pleasure. We study international relations here, and it's just amazing.
Sunaya, are you in Almaty? Sunaya? She muted herself. I believe she's calling from Almaty. Yes. Let's take one more. Peterson Waweru, or whoever's using Peterson's login from Kenya. Here we go.
Hello.
Yes, we hear you. We hear you. Yeah.
Oh, this is Japheth. We are very grateful and privileged from Kenya to be attending this course. Several of us are close to or slightly about 20 of us. Some of them are doing PhD courses, master's courses. And therefore, we are also having different experiences in the region. The region is the region of the Eastern Africa. Kenya is in Eastern Africa, faced with a lot of issues related to this conflict in Sudan, in Somalia, surrounding countries. And therefore, this has been a very important course for all of us. We are grateful to Dan and also to our chairman here, Professor Maluki, for taking us through this kind of a linkage and connection. Thank you so much.
Yes, and that gives me an opportunity to thank Professor Patrick Maluki also. He's been fantastic in coordinating the 20 Kenyans, and we really, really prize your presence. And Professor Shore, we're all taken aback by how common the issues are among these three unlikely countries. We believe this may be the first time that Kazakhstan and Kenya have been directly connected through a university linkage, very informally, but there we are. So that gives you a sense of the scope of the group, and they're a fantastic group. If you had time, I would share with you some of their marvelous essays that are coming in every week. I'm really humbled by the fantastic work that people are doing. So I see the sun is shining in New Haven behind you.
It is. It's
Yeah.
cool, but it's actually a
Yeah.
beautiful sunny day. I walked my son to school and came back here to my office. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I don't want to lecture at you because I feel like in various ways you are all on the front lines of history, and you don't really need a professor sitting in New Haven telling you about your own lives and own experiences. But I thought maybe I could raise a couple issues for discussion, particularly since we have now this geographical diversity, which I love. I could say to the Russian speakers that I've long identified as kind of безродный cosmopolite, a kind of, rootless cosmopolitan.
Yes.
And, despite various attempts of, friends and family to root me, I fundamentally, have this kind of rootless cosmopolitan inclination. And my fantasy for, Ukraine after the victory, is for it to be a kind of cosmopolitan vanguard, of the world. And one of the projects there I was most excited about was when my friend Natalia Gumanyuk called me last spring. I'm sure many of you know her, or in Ukraine. She's this extraordinary journalist who has been, who has been fearless for, as long as I've known her, at least, and covered the Arab Spring and covered the Maidan and covered American elections, and is now working on war crimes documentation. But she called me in the spring and said, I feel like what we need to do is we need to reach out to the global South. There has not been a conversation that's been going on with the global South. Ukraine has been focused on making Europe pay attention to it, of asserting its Europeanness. And there's something kind of self-absorbed about the inter-European conversation, and even the kind of transatlantic, North America plus European conversation, and it's time to reach out to the global South, which I thought was brilliant. Yes, it's time to reach out to the global South. And she said, well, I feel like what needs to happen is people need to actually come here. They need to come to Ukraine. They need to come to Kiev. They need to speak to people in person. They need to have, we need to have live human to contact. And try to understand one another and how we're seeing the world. And she's like, I want to bring a group of journalists from Latin America. I want to bring a group of journalists from Africa. I want to bring a group of journalists from Southeast Asia. And I felt like, yes, that's what has to happen. Those conversations have to happen, and they should have happened long ago. But the moment for bridge building is now, despite the gruesome circumstances, and in some ways, all the more so because of the gruesome circumstances. I feel like it's a time for reaching across borders. It's a time for trying to, extend a hand, and even in profound suffering, be open to the world and trying to hope that other people can understand that. One of the things I know from going through the American experience too, and the very dark Trump years and the Black Lives Matter movement, and this feeling that people have trauma and people have experiences that can never be understood by people who were not themselves. This was a big issue, as Dan knows, in Black Lives Matter. Can white Americans ever understand the experience of Black Americans? And in some sense, the answer is, of course, no, because we can't see into someone else's soul. And my intellectual historian background would tell you that Freud, long ago explained to us that we don't even have perfect access into our own soul. The self is always hidden from the self. Ourselves are not transparent. There's much that's submerged in the unconscious. We always have motives that are more complex than what we're aware of. So if we don't have perfect understanding of our own selves, then all the more so do we not have perfect understanding of somebody else's self. But what I try, what I've been trying to tell my students and what I've been trying to do what I can to work for is the fact that we can't get to perfect understanding doesn't mean that we have to give up on zero understanding, because between nothing and everything, there's a lot of space in between. Between nothing and everything, there's a lot of space to get better understanding, to get some kind of understanding. And I think we need to kind of abandon the totalizing utopian, we will understand perfectly and not at all, the kind of Kierkegaardian either or, and think like, what can we do to have some understanding? What can we do to have some better understanding? Like there's always, we can reach out across borders. We can listen to other people. We can work on translation, even though translation is not perfect and it's never transparent and something always gets lost. That doesn't mean that nothing gets communicated. So I've been kind of, trying without being foolishly idealistic or utopian to say we have to try. We have to try. I'm connected with a very special place in northern Poland on the Polish-Lithuanian border, very close to Belarus, called the Borderlands Foundation. And the Borderlands Foundation was created some 30 years ago by people from the avant-garde theater community who were looking at ethnographic theater as a way of looking at and working through trauma and cross-border conflicts, and dialogues that have frozen, and people that have decided they hate one another, and people who are too traumatized by the past to have reached out anymore. And they've been working now, in this, in the woods, in these provincial places on the border between Poles and Lithuanians and Roma and Jews and Belarusians through art and music and poetry and theater, to have really difficult conversations. And there's a philosophy there that's been developed that we talk about as the philosophy of the bridge. In fact, there's even now a holiday every year on August 23rd, which is the holiday of the bridge. And a slogan that comes from the Polish translation of the Star Wars slogan, "May the Force be with you." So in Polish, it's niech moc będzie z wami. Maybe some of the Slavic speakers will understand this. I will try to put this in the chat. Here's a Star Wars slogan. I don't know how to get the diacritical marks on the chat, but that's okay.
Well, we can do it. Transliteration will be... Got it.
So that's "May the Force be with you." And then there's the word for bridge in Polish is almost like most, it's most. So then there's niech most będzie z wami, which is "May the bridge be with you."
Beautiful.
And I've tried to kind of go with that like we have to keep trying. And one of the things I've been talking to with students in connection with that, and this is a conversation that really got started during the Trump administration, when children were being taken away from their parents at the US-Mexican border and thrown into cages, which some of you may have heard about. And of all the horrible things that happened during the Trump administration, that in some ways was my worst moment. I grew up in a Jewish community. I grew up with Holocaust survivors. I grew up with these stories of parent-child separation. I have kids. It's not hard for me to imagine fleeing violence. I mean, everybody I met in Eastern Europe in the 1990s who had survived Nazism and Stalinism had survived because at some point they were desperately fleeing somewhere and someone on the other side of a border helped them. And I thought, if I were fleeing violence and tried to cross a border with my children and somebody tried to take my children away, I would be capable of killing someone. And I called up immediately Stephen Naron, who is the director of the Fortunov Archive here for Holocaust video testimonies. And I said, Stephen, we have to do something. That we're sitting on this material. We're historians who know this history. We have to make some kind of intervention. And we ended up doing a forum, and the Fortune of Archive commissioned a short documentary film focusing on parent-child separation, which we then sent to a dozen writers in a dozen different countries, and asked them to respond with experiences from their own histories and their own countries. And we ended up doing a forum on the uses and disadvantages of historical comparisons for life. The title is stolen from Nietzsche, as some of you may have gathered. And one of the things I've now been feeling it's important to talk to students about is, how do we use historical comparisons, analogies, categories, labels, patterns? How do we compare colonialism, imperialism, fascism, totalitarianism, settlerism? How do we compare these things across very different cases and across boundaries? How do we use these kinds of, be they metaphors, or be they comparisons, or be they translations? How do we use them as hermeneutic devices, as aids in interpretation? What do they reveal and what do they conceal? How do they help us mediate between the singular and the universal? How can they help us build bridges between people with very diverse experiences while still respecting specificity, and not reducing the complexity of individual human life into categories? There are no easy answers to this question, but this is what I thought I would throw out so we could talk about it today.
My gosh. I'm reading a person's thought. That would be Ellie Klein, who's working, as you know, with Holocaust materials in the United Nations. And I'm hoping, Professor, you might be able to have her talk with Stephen Naran. And
absolutely.
She's not that far from New Haven. That would be marvelous. The Global South, and while other people are thinking of comments, and I hope you are, the Global South, FYI, we have at a very small scale, we've been, I don't know if you're familiar with debunkeu.org in Lithuania, which is the only group that I've been able to find that's actually found a methodology for countering Russian disinformation. And their work up until now has been focused on citizens of the Russian Federation, but we have been working with them to see, and they have vigorously taken up the challenge of working in Africa, where Russian disinformation is flowing so freely, so much without any response. And this thing called the Global Engagement Center in the State Department, it monitors, it studies, it explains disinformation, but it has no way of responding to it. So we just, FYI, a small number of 1 or 2 people in this group have expressed an interest in working with debunkeu.org. I hope you might find that interesting. Global South, absolutely. And we started this course in September by quoting the Kenyan permanent representative to the United Nations, who made the most eloquent statement about why it's wrong to change borders. He made this statement I think Kenya was a rotating member of the Security Council at the time of the invasion. And it was the Kenyan who saw most clearly why it's wrong to violate a national border. And he cited the illogical formation of African borders and reminded us that the African Union's policy is don't change borders. They make no sense. They're crazy. But once we start changing them, there will be violence. I see Maria has a comment. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you. I have a comment on one of the earliest mentions that you said about Ukraine needing to have a dialogue with the Global South. And one thing came to my mind about the foreign policy of Ukraine in the earliest years of its independence. because as Ukrainian students, we learned about it quite a bit. And I could say that Ukraine actually had a policy of multilateralism and trying to establish friendly ties and even strategic cooperation with countries all over the world, for example, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East. And I would say it failed because we overextended our efforts. And we didn't have the full capacity to be an actor that is capable of doing this level of foreign policy. And at the same time, because there was a lack of understanding of where Ukraine stands in between Russia and the European Union, we actually missed, while focusing on other regions besides Europe, we missed the opportunity to present Europe with Ukraine that it needs to see. And therefore, Europe didn't have an understanding of Ukraine up to 2014. And then when 2014 came, we had to do double the work in this regard. And we focused primarily on battling on the battlefield and battling the Russian propaganda and trying to establish ties with Europe. And therefore, we missed the opportunity again to establish ties with the rest of the world. And I would say now, as a Ukrainian, I see a very high level of interest inside of Ukraine of actually communicating with the rest of the world outside of Euro-Atlantic region.
Thank you very much, Maria. And we know that the foreign ministry in Kyiv has been very active, as much as possible, given the limits of resources and such, has been very active in reaching out. I know to Africa. I know they've been doing that, traveling there when possible, and I think other regions as well. Professor, any response to that very thoughtful comment?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. And this dilemma of overextension and of understanding and of countering propaganda. And I'm not at all an expert on foreign policy. I mean, as an intellectual historian, I generally deal with the kind of things that, are as far removed from geopolitics as historians get. I write about philosophy and I write about poets. My historian's impulse through a lot of these conversations, has been the impulse that historians have when they're confronted with political scientists, I would say, or with social scientists in general, is that, okay, you have your model, and you have your policy and you have your chart and you have your graph, but where are the real people? Can we return the conversation to kind of concrete, empirical individuals? And that's my impulse with my students. And then I think Natalia's impulse, when she called me and said, can you help me brainstorm some people who might be willing to come to Kiev, was we need human to human contact. We need individual relationships. We need writers coming, and talking to us. We need to be sitting in the same room. We need to be drinking coffee. We need to be telling one another about our lives. We need real people. And to some extent, I feel like when all of the talking I've done about Ukraine since February 2022, and in some ways, I should say, I feel ridiculous about it because I'm not there. And really, I go to all these American audiences, I go to university alumni, I go to Jewish communities, I go to potential donors, I go to politicians, I go to Capitol Hill. It's ridiculous in some ways that I'm talking about a war when I'm not the one living the war, when I don't know anything about weapons, when I'm not trained in this. But the one thing I can do in terms of countering propaganda that seems to be very effective is the very simple thing that historians do, is I just tell stories about real people. I show up, and I talk to American audiences And sometimes I say, okay, you know, I have a student and my student, you know, my student defended his dissertation and he's now, you know, he's now fighting in the East and he's working here. And I'm going to tell you about the text message he sent me yesterday morning. And I'm going to tell you what he's doing, you know, and I'm going to tell you like what, and I'm telling stories that people could read about on Twitter, or they could read about in the news, or they could read about, but somehow because they're only half a degree of separation removed, once I'm in the same room with those people, you know, and they're people I know personally, and therefore the audience feels like they almost know them personally. And then I use details from these people's lives, often without actually using their names, but, you know, somebody has a daughter who's exactly my daughter's age, or, you know, somebody worked in this archives, or somebody especially likes cats, or, you know, somebody taught my daughter how to ice skate when, you know, when there was a conference in Vienna, or like, and just the being shaken into realizing that these are human beings, you know, that these are individual human beings making choices in the real world, you know, and they're not just algorithms that are kind of floating around on the internet. I have not yet found a better way to counter propaganda than that kind of historian's impulse, is that when in doubt, you go back to the empirical, you go back to the concrete, you go back to the tangible, you go back to the real people in real places at real times.
Yes,
This is a
Professor Dan.
profound statement. Before we bring in the Kenyan participant, let me just say, in my publications, it's always a hidden, you know, like in some movies, you'll have a character appear on the screen for just a couple of seconds, and it's just a little hint. In everything that I've written, I always include the phrase, "All wisdom comes from stories," and I believe that very fervently. I've hidden that in every publication that I've done. I so much agree with you that we learn from stories. Political scientists also, I think, are very compelled to deal with individuals if they're doing their discipline at the best possible way. I think they also benefit from stories. I think the rhetoric, good political rhetoric, always includes anecdotes. And I think what you just said is really very powerful. We had someone from Kenya. Again, people are, just to explain, people are using the same login, so I never know who's. But let's say Peterson, whoever you are. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Peter Mbuva, Dan Whitman.
Peter Mbuva. Oh, very welcome. Very welcome. And thanks for your wonderful papers. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you to our speaker today, Marci Shaw. And if I heard you clearly, she has a lot of humility and compassion to understand people who are in agony, who are in a very bad and devastating situation. And I likened her to people who are pursuing humanitarian assistance in areas where non-combatants have been heavily affected by war. And I think if all of us can think in that direction, then we are able to bring peace in the world. Because even as Professor Joan Kaltung will talk about peace as being negative or positive, even when you are at a negative peace, it's absence of violence. But when your brothers and sisters suffer, you also suffer. And we have suffered, even Africa as a continent, because of war happening between Ukraine and Russia. Then the other issue is just a pointer to foreign policy. I've actually learned a lot from Dan class, and I want to build my expertise on foreign policy. They say that experts is that what they say is that when a country lacks foreign policy, it's like a ship in the middle of an ocean lacking direction. So every country will have their own foreign policy. And what I've seen is that even choosing to have relation with another country, that is in itself a foreign policy. And therefore, this divide of global north global south has really brought differences, and some seeing themselves as down and unable to capitalize on the opportunities they have. As Africa, as a continent, I think we can rise above and do more than what we are doing to match the rest in terms of competitiveness. Then, Dan, if you can talk on disinformation, it's an area I've seen quite interesting. Countries that have been accused of using systematic cyber attacks actually to disinform public to change their perception about their democracy. Russia has been accused in the American election and China. And today I was somewhere having a conversation on digital disinformation. And it is being mentioned as one of a serious challenge that has to be addressed to talk about digital diplomacy. Thank you, Professor Dan.
Thank you, Peter. And I don't know if you're watching the construction in your city in Nairobi of an RT headquarters. We know that much of Russian disinformation comes from RT channel. They have actually built a physical structure in Johannesburg, and their next project will be in Nairobi. So this becomes, Russia has understood the importance of the global south, and we need to do the same. Professor, any reflections on that?
Well, I look at like the generation of my kids and who are growing up, in the age of the internet. I was the last generation to grow up pre-internet. When I started college, there was no internet, and it was just kind of coming on the scene as I was finishing. Yes. So I remember I remember just how dramatic that break was. And I know for them, the combination of the internet, and they're very involved through their parents in this war in Ukraine, and global warming, they have an intuitive sense that I think was missing for those of us who are older, of our interconnectedness, that we live, for better or for worse, we live in this world together. Like we live in this world together, and it's more and more of a global world, and things that happen in one place, in part because of what Hannah Arendt calls the boundlessness of human interrelatedness, have repercussions everywhere else. So in some sense, that has to be our starting point. We have to accept that we live in this world together, and therefore we have to care about one another and what's happening in places where we don't happen to be at the moment.
Tell us more about Hannah Arendt, if you feel that that's relevant to this discussion. That's a beautiful quote.
Hannah Arendt was one of my earliest and most long-lasting loves. She's a thinker I continue to feel very, very close to. And, one of her, in some ways, only or kind of very rare Hegelian moment comes in The Human Condition, where she talks about human action and humans' capacity for action, which she connects with what she calls natality. This kind of the ability to give birth, which for Arendt is both literal and metaphorical, the ability to set something new in motion. This, what she calls this character, the possibility we have of introducing the new, and this character of the unexpected, that is particular to human action. And she says, and she's referencing here a kind of argument that happens between Hegel and Kant. So maybe I'll step back and tell you that Hegel-Kant argument, which, for the people who are that more practical non-philosopher people, this might be too much philosophy, but this is my intellectual historian's hat. So for Kant, morality is all about good intentions. For Kant, you have to be a good person, to make a moral choice, is to do the thing you have a duty to do, as opposed to the thing you just happen to feel like doing. And it's to ask yourself two test questions. One is, well, if I act in this way, you know, would the principle that follows from that, if applied universally, be a good thing? In other words, you ask yourself, what would happen if everybody was going to act according to this principle? If it would be a disaster, then you're probably not doing something good. And then the other test question, is you always treat another human being as an end and never as a means. You always turn to another person as a subject, not an object, as a person and not a thing. And Kant says, like, that's how we evaluate moral action. Now, once you act, your actions then enter into a realm of causality that you cannot control. Once you act, there are too many things that are beyond your control. You can't actually control the consequences of your actions. You might act with very good intentions, with moral intentions, but this might lead to disastrous consequences. Kant says, not your fault. Not your fault. Like, all you can do, like, in the Kantian morality is all about intentions. And then Hegel comes along and says, well, this is a completely inadequate understanding of morality, because actions, not only occasionally, but as a rule, have consequences far in excess of their intentions. And therefore we can only really know the meaning of an action in retrospect, looking back. This is where you get Hegel's famous, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings, only with the coming of the dusk. That it's only when it's all over that we have any chance to see what it was all about. And Arendt, while she's generally not a Hegelian, this is her very Hegelian moment. She says that is actions always have consequences beyond their intent, because of what she calls the boundlessness of human interrelatedness. That the consequences of an action literally go on until the end of time, because there's no means of cutting off the web of ways in which we are all connected. In colloquial American terms, you would now call this the butterfly effect. Right?
Yeah.
And so that, she forces us to think about that, and says, we set something new in motion. That is in some ways the miracle that saves the world. And then we can't know where it's going to go. That's why she says the actor is never the author of his or her own life story. It's only the historian looking back who has any chance to see what it was all about.
Marvelous. I think you've just shown to us we are all philosophers, whether we know it or not. I think, can we say that Kant, Hegel, and Arendt are thesis, antithesis? Could we say that? And there's the famous Kierkegaard line, which I can actually say in Danish.
Danish?
Leves foran, men det forstås bagved. Life is lived forward, but is understood.
Yes.
And not to, I'm not trying to show erudition, but what you mentioned about Kant brings to mind a little. I have not read the entire Bhagavad Gita, but there's a line in it where it says, quote, "Do not be concerned with the fruits of your actions." And the idea is the archer can aim the arrow, can prepare the action of releasing the arrow from the bow, and then must accept whatever happens after the bow leaves, after the arrow leaves the bow. This is, so I guess the Bhagavad Gita would be more Kantian. But this is most fascinating. Thank you. I think this certainly gets me thinking, and I think everybody else. Maria has another comment. Is it on this topic, Maria?
I have two. I have one on the, actually it's quite a question, maybe not a comment, about whether or not the intentions should be adjusted to the consequences of the previous action. Like, if you know that this intention leads to the unintended consequence, should you in the future change your intention and act accordingly in order to be on the right side of the world, so to speak? And my comment would be on my understanding of Russian propaganda and how it uses. So I will start because I wrote quite a structure. So we know that, at least in my understanding, the current state of the world is quite humanitarian or humanistically driven, in the sense that the media is quite focused on the human experience of people in conflicts, the human experience of the economy, of life in general. We always see standard of living being discussed in the news and so on. So individual lives are much more highlighted nowadays than historically, because historically, when the war starts, nobody is counting the human lives. It's just about the end goal. But nowadays, the situation is different. And I would say that Russia understood this trend and tried to take control over it, in the sense that it is using the mass of information, the sheer amount of information it releases into the information space, and it uses it repeatedly. So it's trying to overpower the true facts that it wants to hide with the amount of information, because precisely Russia knows that the antidote to its actions lies in the precision, as you mentioned, the intricate details, the stories sometimes of separate individuals, like the decision makers, the people controlling the events, and so on. So this is my understanding.
Marvelous. And I maybe the professor can review with us ethos, logos, and pathos.
Right. No, there's lots of things there. No, the question of adjusting actions to consequences. In some ways, I mean, I think those of us who, care about what we're doing are constantly trying. There's a wonderful essay by Leszek Kolakowski. Let me see if I can find it, in called "Ethics Without a Code," Etyka bez kodeksu, where he's saying we're always there is no magical formula that says, okay, in situation X you do Y, in situation Z you do A, and that guarantees you that you're going to get a moral outcome. We're always forced to choose with incomplete information, and we're constantly forced to choose in situations in which there might be no good choices, in which all possible choices might involve causing suffering. I mean, these are the most wrenching kinds of things. I mean, I take my students through certain kinds of examples, like when we talk about the Munich conference in September 1938. We talk about, in that connection, we talk about the origins of the First World War, the 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, who assassinates the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in 1914 in Sarajevo, the conflict between the Habsburg Empire and Serbia, the way in which that conflict, the way in which the Habsburg Empire ends up declaring war on Serbia, and then Germany gets in on the side of the Habsburgs, and then the Tsarist Empire gets in on the side of Serbia, and then one by one, you have all of these countries jumping into the First World War, which then ends up to be a war on a scale Europe had never previously conceived of. And 20 years later, when Chamberlain is going to Munich to meet with Hitler, who is demanding the Sudetenland, he's thinking about 1914 and thinking, we were all just a little too quick. We were just like, the costs were so horrific. We're so far above what we could have imagined that at all cost at the time, we should have been more restrained. we should have made compromises. We should have tried to keep a local conflict. We should have tried to keep what was happening, between Sarajevo and Vienna, because even if we have feelings about who was right and who was wrong, look at what happened. I mean, I think I'm not an expert on Neville Chamberlain. I think his intentions were good. I think Neville Chamberlain goes to Munich. Hitler demands the Sudetenland and says, if you give this to me, I will be satisfied. There are lots of ethnic Germans there. There will not be a war. There will be peace. Everything will calm down and we'll go home. Neville Chamberlain comes back to London, famous, infamous words, I bring you peace in our time. Now, in historical terms, that is like the, example par excellence of bad decision making. Neville Chamberlain clearly makes the wrong decision, at Munich. In English, we say the appeasement at Munich. In Czech, the phrase is always zdrada v Mnichově, the betrayal at Munich. If he had made a different decision, then we would be living in another world. But I think we can say very categorically that was a disaster. I don't think we can say he had bad intentions. I think he was looking at history and thinking he had learned lessons, which was not, which there's an argument to be made. He had learned those lessons. They just weren't going to apply in the way that you thought. But we're always working with that kind of incomplete information. There's always this realm of contingency. I just wrote a piece for the German media that is this out in German in the Tageszeitung this week for the 10th anniversary of the Maidan. And so I was revisiting Mustafa Naim's famous Facebook post from November 21st, where he writes that Facebook post, and says, hey guys, if, let's get serious. If you're really upset, come out to the Maidan by midnight tonight, likes do not count. Now, suppose he was sick that day. Suppose he was preoccupied with something else. Suppose he forgot to hit send. Suppose his Facebook account wasn't working. Like, had that Facebook post not gone out, the Maidan might not have happened. The revolution might not have happened, and we would be in a different world. And history turns on those moments. It turns on those moments of contingency. Clearly, there was a critical mass of Ukrainians who were ready in the end to risk their lives for this, who were willing to risk their lives for freedom. But you might never have found out about that at that moment had not this 32-year-old journalist pressed send on that Facebook post.
This gives us chills, what you're saying, Professor. And thank you for being the only person I've ever met who has a kind word about Neville Chamberlain. Because, I mean, of course he had good intentions. And would you say also that when we see so many times people referring to Munich 38 as an argument for being belligerent. And this, it's not necessarily a model that can guide accurately future decisions, very difficult decisions. We see this term all the time by people, frankly, who would rather be in a conflict than not when they say Munich 38. I want to encourage people in Almaty to come in. I know you're thinking hard about this, and please feel free to come in. Meanwhile, we have another Kenyan comment on the line. Again, whether it's Peterson or Peter or Patrick, you're welcome. Please come in. Let's see. Ellie, I am pressing ask to unmute, but it's not responding. Ellie, can you?
Both Peterson members have like speaking privileges.
Okay. And we see, again, forgive me, Mekabred. I should remember your real name. Come in from Almaty. Yes, please.
Hey, I'm Alikan or Ali Khan.
Ali Khan. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you see me?
Oh,
yes.
Now I can see you. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I wanted to just talk about the Munich crisis. So it's funny that you mentioned that, Dan Whitman, because in fact, today in class, I mentioned Munich 38 as an example of why sometimes concessions are not a good idea. So we were discussing the Iranian crisis with the US. So I think you should be somewhat, should have expertise about that crisis. So what the argument that I put forward is that, as we've seen in the Munich crisis, if you are too eager to commit to appeasement, it can bite you in the butt later. So, and in the news, I think everyone has seen that Biden gave $10 billion to Iran, but not to Iran. They helped Iraq pay off the debt that they had to Iran, which is $10 billion, and so they indirectly gave money to Iran, and that move by Biden obviously was criticized by many, and yeah, so that was an easy argument for me. So I latched onto that and said, remember what happened in Munich. We shouldn't do that in this situation. So yeah.
Thank you, Alec.
Yeah.
And when you say the Iran crisis, which of the many? The current one or the? Yeah.
It's the ongoing tensions with Iran threatening to develop nuclear weapons in case the US doesn't lift its very harsh economic sanctions. And what I've argued is that their resolve is not limited to only economic sanctions. What I said. So when you lift economic sanctions, it only means that they have more finance to pay for their nuclear weapon development. And I said that's a bad idea.
I think that's a perfect example of how good intentions can have opposite effects depending on which good intention you act on. That's brilliant, Ali Khan. Thank you.
And so I just wanted to ask you personally, do you think that was a good argument, or was it one of those, people that seek conflict only say that we shouldn't repeat the Munich 38 case?
He's asking for a grade, Professor. How do we grade?
No, I would have to get my mind around much more specifically around Iran at the moment, which I don't. I mean, I have been thinking about Iran because on those, I saw Roger Cohen, the columnist from the New York Times, was here last week talking about the Middle East. And the last time I had seen him in person was 2010, when he was in Vienna speaking about a trip he had just made to Iran and to the demonstrations there. And I remember one thing he said at the time. He said, I have never seen anybody act with more dignity than the Iranian people on the streets did during those demonstrations. And it was very moving. I mean, he had spent some time there, and he was clearly very impressed and felt like these people who had been crushed by sheer violence so deserved to have won. And I mean, I had thought about that again last year when these incredibly brave women were rising up. And then I was thinking about that again, last month with the Hamas attacks. I thought, this Iranian regime that has carried out so much violence against their own citizens and against their own people, and have been providing Putin with drones, and have been funding Hamas. And I think back then to my very early childhood in the late 70s. And I think, if things had gone the other way in the late 70s, would we be in this situation that we're in now? But I'm like all historical comparisons and analogies, I feel like I tell the students that, there was a big debate during the Trump administration, can we use the word fascism? And I tell them that, comparisons are like hermeneutic devices. They enable us to mediate between the singular and the universal. And they're like putting on glasses. So you put on certain kinds of glasses, and what is close up is very clear, but what is far away is blurry. And then you change them for another pair of glasses, and what's far away is clear, but what is close up is blurry. And so we constantly need to be trying on the different glasses and trying to figure out, can we see in this situation both what is general and what is particular, what is similar and what is different? That it's not a kind of either or question. Are we allowed to use this comparison? Are we not? but how do we use it? Can we use it critically? Can we use it to illuminate certain things? When there was a comment made by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez about the camps at the border being like concentration camps, and the Holocaust Museum said, we categorically prohibit, any kind of analogies with the Holocaust. I thought, you can't prohibit analogies because that's part of how we think. I mean, thinking with metaphors, thinking with translation, thinking with patterns and comparisons and analogies, that is part of how we think, and it shouldn't be fetishized and it shouldn't be totalized. It should be understood, as, why we need to try on these different glasses.
Wow.
May I add something
Please do.
else?
Yeah.
So, as I was listening to you, Miss Marci, if that's fine to call you.
You can just call me Marci. That's fine.
Yeah, Marci. Yeah, PhD Marci. So you mentioned the Iranian people, and you've separated the government from the people. And now I've realized the mistakes in my own thinking. So because I was too caught up in thinking about the politics, the weapons, the nuclear weapons. But now you've mentioned that the ones that suffer are the Iranian people that don't have anything to do with nuclear weapon development or the policy decisions. And so these sanctions, the economic sanctions, the harsh deterrence strategies, the brinkmanship that I suggested we should use. When I say we, I mean the U.S. And obviously, I'm not the U.S. Hypothetically, we as in U.S. So yeah. What I'm trying to say is that, it's a very difficult moral dilemma when you're trying to avert a crisis, but you also have the people to think about, because when you're using economic sanctions, it's not a laser pinpointing sanctions that can only target the people in power. It also affects people that are that don't have any power, and those people are who suffer the most, no matter what you do, no matter your decisions, they always suffer. So yeah, that's a very, now I've opened my eyes a little wider, I think.
Ali Khan, thank you. That's brilliant. And I will say, I've never made foreign policy, but I've been involved as a sort of a practitioner. And I say, I remember very clearly, this mistake is universal by governments that make foreign policy. When they talk about Russia, they're really talking about Putin. When they talk about Syria, they're really talking about Assad. And far too seldom do governments consider the 99% of the people, and they use the professor can remind me of the Latin figure of speech where is it called metonymy, where you're talking, you refer to one thing, maybe one person, really you're implying the entire whole. Is it metonymy? Is that
metonymy?
Yeah. And it's a mistake that foreign policy practitioners make all the time. Thank you for coming to that realization, Ali Khan. I think you knew that before, but you reminded yourself of it.
Yeah, I forgot.
Professor, any comment on the people versus the government?
I mean, I think Ali just explained it very well. This is the moral dilemma. That's one of the many reasons why, the choices are not so obvious, because I talk my students through this all the time. I mean, what happens when, in order to do something good, innocent people have to suffer. In order to protect some people, you have to hurt other people. It's one of the things we've been tearing our hair out about in Russia. I got a long message from a graduate student in Petersburg, who was, pushing back against, blaming all the Russians for the war. And he's an anti-Putinist, he's educated urban intelligentsia. He knows that this is evil. He knows that something horrible is happening. He knows that there's absolutely no reason for Putin to have attacked Ukraine. But he feels like, but my classmates, who have been drafted and have to fight there, they're victims too. like they're just slaves. They don't want to be there. They don't want to be killing Ukrainians. You know, they're forced. Nobody gave them a choice. They have no other possibilities, you know, and I feel sorry for them. And why doesn't anyone show them any sympathy? But I also understand the Ukrainians who are saying, like, if you had all refused, we wouldn't be in this situation. Okay, so you're being forced, but you're killing us. Like, I mean, how do you possibly, you know, and I've pondered a lot, like what to say to the graduate student in St. Petersburg, you know, who's like, you know, these people are slaves. This is a Russian army of slaves. This is not a Russian army of people who just want to kill Ukrainians, but they're victims too. And then you think, okay, but at what point, like, you know, how much can you expect of people? You know, can you demand that everybody be willing to risk their lives, you know, and rise up? There are no easy questions to these kinds of moral dilemmas.
Even under coercion and threat of death, it is an individual free choice, is it not, to pick up a weapon and use it. And for everybody, just a little plug here, on the 30th, that is a week from Thursday, we will have Max Bergman, whose topic is sanctions. And I think economic sanctions fall directly into this discussion. Sanctions, we talk about targeted sanctions, which may be effective. It's a very untested technique, and very often sanctions hurt the people that they're meant to help. And we'll hear more about that from Max on the 30th. Maria, again, you're welcome as many times as you want to come in. Maria.
Yes, thank you. I have maybe a few comments. First, I will start with the comments on the latest discussion developments. In my opinion, yes, there is no way to generalize the whole population and say whether the whole population of one country is entirely evil or entirely innocent of the actions of their government. The example that you provided with Iran and the people, which in my opinion, I was also following the events of the most recent revolution attempt in Iran, and I have the biggest level of respect to the people who went and actually risked their individual freedoms, their individual safety to see change in their country. But I would say that in countries under authoritarian rule, there is not only the population which is opposed to its rule, there is also always a percentage of that population who support it. And I would say, while we cannot directly assess whether the population is bad or good, we can at least get the idea of the general proportion of the people who support and who don't. Because with 100% of population being against and being ready to actually take action, there wouldn't be a chance for that government to stand to keep in power. And that is, I think, the nuance that we have to keep in mind when assessing the innocence of Russian population in this war, or of Iranian population when their government is sending out lethal weapons. And I would say that I also thought about this question a lot because, you know, as Ukrainians, our population was a participant of the Soviet regime. And in many cases, there were historically Ukrainians who risked their all to fight and to change the government. There were other Ukrainians who were compliant with the actions of the Soviet regime, and who even actively supported and helped it in its illegal actions. And while assessing this heritage of like ambiguity, I thought about what is the level of responsibility that a person has in these circumstances. And I think that like on the individual level, of course, you can say that I am only able to change so much in my circumstances. But on the societal level, individualism doesn't work when you are living under an authoritarian regime and you are actually trying and wanting it to change, because a person has an obligation. If they want to call themselves opposing to the government, they have an obligation to at least act in certain ways to oppose it, not just saying that I have this position, therefore it counts, but maybe talking to their because once again, I would say the devil is in the details, and your everyday actions count in this situation, because if you are living within a society that is affected by propaganda, internal propaganda, and you know that you have relatives who believe it, and you have co-workers who are maybe aiding the flawed elections that help Putin stay in power, you have a responsibility to act on that personal level, try to persuade them, try to stop them, to prevent them in aiding the regime in this, at least this personal level. So I would say there is a level of saying that I am innocent because I am not doing the bad action, but there is also a level of responsibility to actually be proactive in the situation.
Maria, I want to see your book, your future book on that topic. Right, Professor? I mean, that's an easy question. What is the level of responsibility of the individual? Oh my gosh, how can there ever be an adequate answer? Right, Professor?
No, it's something I've thought a lot about. And, you know, one of the ways in which I really tried to kind of intervene in the argument, the German-Russian, in Germany and Russia, was to try to disentangle guilt from responsibility. And to try to make the argument that guilt is contingent. In Russian, you'd say uslovno. You know, guilt relates to something you did or didn't do. I don't believe it can be inherited. Responsibility in kind of Heideggerian terms, I would say, is always already. It's not contingent. It's a priori. It's always with us all the time. The cause and source of our responsibility is not personal guilt. The source of our responsibility is that we live in this world with other people. Heidegger would say it's in der Welt sein. The cause that, like, the source of responsibility is not, because our grandparents did X, or Y, or our ancestors did, or our nation did before. Or the source of responsibility is that we are human beings. We live in this world with other people, and therefore we are always already responsible. It's unconditional. It's a priori. There is no escape from responsibility. And that then, like, that, that then really raises the question of, like, that what can we do? And I have, like, of all the moral dilemmas of the present moment, it is the most difficult for me has been in some ways, the how to relate to the Russian opposition and the Ukrainian feeling. Many of my Ukrainian friends and colleagues feel like, they are all implicated. They failed to overthrow this regime, that we don't want anything to do with them anymore. And I look at some of my friends and colleagues in the opposition and think they have done things that are so much braver than anything I've ever done. I mean, I hosted here 2 weeks ago, some of you may know Elena Kostuchenko, who is a journal, an investigative reporter from Novaya Gazeta. She came from a town called Yaroslav, an impoverished single mother, at the age of 15 because she read Anna Politkovskaya's reporting from Chechnya and decided that she was going to be a journalist like that. She was going to tell the truth, and she came to Novaya Gazeta, and she reported fearlessly, and she was repeatedly arrested and beaten, and she kept going back, and she kept telling these stories. And in 2014 and 2015, when the war started in the Donbass, she went to the Donbass and she ran around, and she got the first serious interview with a Russian soldier who admitted to being a Russian soldier at the moment when Putin denied there were any Russian soldiers at all in the Donbass. She snuck into a hospital in Donetsk after a tank battle and found somebody willing to speak to her. And it's an extraordinary interview. I can send you the link. And she time and time again, she was risking her life. And she tells this story in her book on February 24th, in the middle of the night. She woke up, she went outside to smoke. She comes back to the bedroom. Her girlfriend is sitting on the bed, staring at the phone with a kind of terrifying expression on her face. And Lena says, "What's going on?" And Diana, her girlfriend, now fiance, says, "They're bombing Kiev." And Lena says, "We're bombing Kiev? Me bombing?" And Yana says, "Yes, we are bombing Kiev." And she goes to the Novaya Gazeta office, and the editors look at her and they say one thing. They say, "Ty gotova," "Are you ready?" And she says, "Koniecznie gotova." She said, "Of course I'm ready." And she leaves right then for Ukraine. She gets there, her phone doesn't work because everything's been cut off. The internet isn't working. Her credit cards don't work. She's running around. She's covering the East. She's writing reportage from Mykolaiv, from Kherson. She's on her way to Mariupol during the siege when her contact in Ukrainian intelligence calls and says, "You're being targeted for assassination by the Russian forces at the border. You can't go into Mariupol." And she says, "I have to go." And then her editor, Dmitry Muratov, who won the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years ago from Novaya Gazeta, called and says, the Russians were targeting you for assassination. You can't go. You have to get out of there. She said, "I have to get to Mariupol." They said, "You don't understand. You must leave Ukraine now." And she said, "Okay, I'm coming back to Russia." And Muratov says, "No, you're not coming back to Russia. You'll be killed immediately." And so she goes to Berlin, where she thinks she's safe, and then ends up the victim of an FSB poisoning in Munich, which she survives, although she's still quite weak. That this was last year. In any case, so Lena was here, talking about her book, which has just come out in English, about reporting from this lost Russia, and it was the first time I actually, since February 24th, had gathered Ukrainians and Russians in one room at Yale. And it was difficult, and there was a lot of crying, and it was wrenching, and it was painful for everyone. But I felt like it was really important that she say certain things that I couldn't say. And I also felt like, despite the calls for how can you have Russian speakers at a moment when the Russians are, when Russians are slaughtering people in Ukraine, and I felt like, she is so much braver than I have ever been. She has risked her life to tell Russians the truth about what's happening in Ukraine time and time again. I'm in no position, to say, okay, we're going to have a boycott of all Russians. But I know that she constantly feels she hasn't done enough. She feels like we watched fascism come to being in our country and we failed to stop it. And that is on us, and there's no escape from that guilt, and there's no escape from that responsibility. So that question of, when is it ever enough? Is it never enough? How much can you expect of ordinary people? These are questions I ask myself every day, and I have yet to find any decisive answers to them.
Well, I think we end where we started, with the idea that only through stories can we see clearly any way through these dilemmas. Maria has another comment. And I have many, but I'll keep them. I'll I'll keep them as we end. And if you want to take one more comment, Marci, we can do that.
Yeah, let's let Maria take one more comment.
I would just say, if you mentioned Hegel, Kant, Arendt, and I think we know what your favorite is, but if you have suggested readings that can give us in a bite-sized form the essences of those three, we'd be glad to get information in the form of an email later and have a look at these three. Okay, Maria, I commend you for being so active. Here you go again. Maria, go ahead.
I would say I'm so active because this is the like exactly the topic that got me passionate about politics and history in general. When I was in the 10th grade in high school, learning about sort of the most modern, so the 20th century history of Ukraine, I learned a lot about this exact topic of responsibility and like what is enough, the dissidents in the Soviet Union, for example, and this is exactly what I want to start with. The story of that journalist that you've told us about sounds exactly like the story of dozens and hundreds of Ukrainian dissidents in the Soviet times who, and not only dissidents, general writers, poets, who had a certain vision, and for that vision they got executed. We have many stories like that, and so I would say on an individual level, Ukrainians understand this extent to which one person can act. But at the same time, this is why I focused on the level on the idea that on the social level, individualism doesn't work, and that there has to be like certain people can focus on individual tasks like covering the events and providing people with information. But if nobody is doing the groundwork, nobody is connecting with others and mobilizing others and engaging the others to go to their side, the people who are affected by the propaganda, they do not see the need to actually stop believing it, because nobody is working directly with them. Nobody is explaining to them on the personal level in the day-to-day life, like their friends, their relatives, and so on, why this isn't true, why this is immoral, and so on. Yeah, I would say the focus on others is maybe something that Russia lacks nowadays. There are many intellectualists in Russia that are opposing Putin, but I would say in many cases the extent of their work ends on just being intellectually against Putin and putting their position into scientific realms, but not actually going and doing the groundwork that Russia needs.
Wonderful distinction: individual thought, social action. And I think if we had the glorious privilege of studying with Marci Shore, we would know more about how most thinking, maybe all thinking, is done at the individual level, even when the individual believes that they cannot prevail in a situation. This is a wonderful comment, Maria. Maybe the professor has a reflection in response.
I mean, this is, again, you're on to the right problems, and to some extent, they're collective action problems, right? 50 people go out in the street, they arrest them all. 500, they arrest them all. 5,000, they arrest them all. And they're close to 20,000 people who have been arrested for protesting the war in Russia. At what point do you hit the tipping point? A Ukrainian colleague of mine who was visiting last year, who is he comes from the world of economics, so he's good with numbers, unlike myself, and I was like, Vlad, what would it take? he said, Marci, 2 million people in the streets of Moscow. It's over tomorrow. I said, Vlad, how do you know it's 2 million? Is 1.9 million not enough? Like, when is it the one additional person that pushes something over there's always a tipping point. And you don't know when you're going to reach that tipping point. But that, like, I keep thinking about Ceausescu in December 1989, and like, and still every morning I get up thinking, like, maybe this is the day. You don't, like, you never know. Like, and you keep hoping for that. I mean, if to bring it back to Hegel one more time, looking at Russia and Ukraine, and seeing how much Ukraine has changed just in the 20 some years I've been, following it or hanging out there. The interesting question that Hegel's master slave dialectic inspires is that, why do you have subjectivity that has emerged then on behalf of the colonized and not on behalf of the colonizer? Because if we look at, and if we look at this through the glasses of the imperial, colonized colonizer framework, and say Russia's the colonizer and Ukraine is the colonized, it's Ukrainians where a critical mass of people have developed a sense of subjectivity, of responsibility, of agency. And the crisis in Russia has to do with, that not having happened. You don't have that. We haven't had a critical mass of people that has a sense of their own sense of agency, and when do you get that? When does it take off exponentially? How do you hit the tipping point? I wish I had the answer to that. I'm counting on all you bright young people, to keep pushing and to try to figure something out.
This is marvelous. And we've prevailed on you, Marci Shore. You've been so generous with us. I see on your bookshelf you have a signal. I have a little response of my own. It's in these times, what we do know is that we all have positive feelings towards Ukraine and Ukrainians. This may not be an eternal state, but at the moment, I think we all are united by this feeling, and it's difficult to stand inert and to not be part of the wonderfully courageous actions on the part of Ukrainians. You remind us that if we are inclined to condemn all Russians and everything about Russia, we may be misinterpreting what's really happening. We can only know the answers through anecdotes and through stories like the ones you have just told about Elena Kostuchenko, whose name, I believe, is Ukrainian because it ends with an Enko.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Yeah. Listen, we're so grateful. You've gone far beyond the amount of time that you promised you would be with us. We want to stay in touch with you, and I can only say thank you from all of us to you. And we promise we will think about these very difficult questions, and we promise we'll never have the arrogance to imagine that we have found the perfect answer. Thank you.
But I'm counting on you guys all to brainstorm. Dan, thank you so much for the invitation. It was lovely to meet all of you, and keep thinking.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Всего хорошего и до скорого.
Всего хорошего. No, до побачення.
До побачення. До побачення. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.